My sister laughed as she twirled in my wedding dress, the lace torn and stained with red wine, while my parents clapped like it was some grand performance. I stood frozen, heart pounding, watching the very dream I had worked years for unravel in her careless hands. They thought I would cry, swallow the humiliation, and move on like I always had. But this time, something shifted. The betrayal cut deeper than ever before. And what Sophia didn't realize was that the very dress she ruined would become the thread pulling her world apart. I was 30 years old, and for most of those years, I had been the silent backbone of a family that rarely noticed my weight on their shoulders. My father had died when I was 13, leaving me with a grieving mother who remarried a man far too quickly. Along with him came a new set of rules, new loyalties, and a little sister who would grow into the center of everyone's world. Her name was Sophia, and while she was still learning to walk, I was already learning to give up. I remember the day I received my acceptance letter to a university across the country, along with a scholarship that could have changed everything. My hands shook as I held the crisp envelope, the promise of a future filled with lectures, travel, and opportunities I had only dreamed of. But by then, Sophia was 6 years old, and my mother's second husband had already made it clear that family came first. Family meant me staying home to care for Sophia when childcare was too expensive. Family meant surrendering that scholarship so the household wouldn't collapse without my presence. I can still see the letter, yellowing at the corners, tucked in a drawer under stacks of old lesson plans. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, I would take it out, trace the words, and imagine the life that might have been mine. But imagination does not pay bills, and choices once made cannot be undone. I folded the paper back and reminded myself, it wasn't just lost, it was given. And giving had become my nature. Sophia grew up in the warmth of that giving. She was radiant, with golden hair that seemed to catch every stray ray of sunlight, and a laugh that drew attention wherever she went. I adored her, even when I knew she was spoiled, even when she snapped her fingers and expected me to appear like some invisible servant. I told myself it was worth it, that she would one day realize what I had sacrificed for her. But recognition never came. Instead, the more she was praised, the smaller I seemed to become. Teachers would gush about her talents at school plays, while I sat in the audience clapping the loudest, unnoticed. Relatives cooed over her beauty at family gatherings, rarely asking me about my job or my life. To them, I was simply the responsible one, the safety net, the person who kept the wheels turning while Sophia danced freely above. As we grew older, the contrast only sharpened. I became a high school teacher, steady but unremarkable in their eyes. Sophia, meanwhile, announced she was pursuing art, and while her grades and effort often fell short, my stepfather declared she had a gift. Money that could have eased my living expenses went to fund her art classes, her exhibitions, her travels. I covered the rest with my own salary, quietly slipping bills into the household account, ensuring the lights stayed on, ensuring Sophia's world remained bright. The night I overheard my stepfather speaking to her, my chest tightened. He said, "Your sister will never shine the way you do, Sophia. But don't worry, she knows her place." The words weren't meant for me, but they cut deeper than any blade. I realized then that in their eyes, my role had been written, the shadow to Sophia's spotlight. By 26, Sophia had blossomed into the kind of woman magazines adored, elegant, vivacious, and hungry for more. That was when she met Richard, the heir to a wealthy family with connections that stretched across the city like a web. From the first dinner they attended together, my mother's eyes glittered with pride. My stepfather couldn't stop telling everyone how Sophia had caught the prize. They introduced her as though she were a queen, while I, the older sister, was presented as little more than an afterthought. It didn't take long before Sophia began avoiding me in public. At gatherings, she would angle her body away, as though the presence of a teacher sister dulled her shine. One night, when I suggested she slow down and think carefully before diving headfirst into Richard's world, she laughed, tossing her hair back with practiced grace. "Don't worry, sis," she said with a smile sharp enough to cut. "Soon, you won't even be part of this family." The words lingered long after she left the room, clinging to me like smoke. I sat alone in the quiet, the old scholarship letter folded neatly in my drawer, and felt the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made pressing against my chest. Little did I know. Every sacrifice would become a weapon used against me. The wedding invitation arrived in a gold-trimmed envelope, sealed with the kind of flourish that spoke more of wealth than sincerity. My name was printed there, Hannah Miller, in elegant cursive. But as my eyes scanned the card, my stomach twisted. No +1. No acknowledgement of the life I might have outside this family. Just me, standing alone, as if that was all I would ever be. When I asked about it, my mother smiled in that dismissive way she had perfected over the years. "It's a very formal event, Hannah. Space is limited. We're only inviting people who matter." Her tone was light, but the words clanged like iron in my ears. My stepfather added, "You should understand, dear. This is Sophia's big day. We can't make exceptions. It's not personal." Not personal. The words tasted bitter. Of course it was personal. It always had been. I nodded, keeping my voice calm even as my chest tightened. "I understand." That night, when I returned home, I slid the invitation into the top drawer of my desk. The gold trim caught the light for a moment before disappearing into the dark. I closed the drawer softly, as if sealing away my hurt. For a while, I just sat there, staring at the wood grain, willing myself not to cry. Tears would solve nothing. Tears had never solved anything. But I couldn't shake the sting. Even in the moment that should have been about unity, about family, they had found a way to make me less. Still, that wasn't the worst of it. It was the following week when the true humiliation arrived. I came home from school one Friday evening, exhausted from grading essays, and found the garment bag missing from my closet. Panic rose in my throat. I had saved for 2 years to buy that dress, the wedding gown I had dreamed of. Delicate lace and satin, simple but beautiful, a promise to myself that one day I, too, would walk down an aisle. I called out, but the house was empty. Hours later, when I opened my phone, I understood. There she was, Sophia, spinning under a chandelier at some glittering party, my wedding dress clinging to her body. She had pulled the lace tight to fit her slimmer frame, the hem brushing across marble floors already stained with red wine. She held a glass high, her smile wide, as friends cheered and snapped photos. And then the caption, "Funny how this dress looks better on me than it ever would on her." The comments were filled with laughing emojis, heart eyes, people praising her beauty. Not one person questioned why she was wearing her sister's gown. Not one person thought about the quiet woman behind the screen, staring at the phone with trembling hands. My mother shared the post with a string of exclamation points. "Our star looks stunning, doesn't she?" My stepfather replied, "Always knew she was born to shine." I wanted to scream. Instead, I closed the phone and pressed it against my chest, my breath shallow. That dress had been my symbol of hope, my private promise. And now it was nothing but a costume in Sophia's endless performance. When she finally returned the gown 2 days later, she tossed it onto my bed without a word. The lace was ripped at the seams, the bodice stained a deep burgundy that would never come out. I picked it up with shaking hands, the fabric slipping through my fingers like sand. In the living room, I heard them laughing, my mother's voice bright and careless. "It was just a dress, Hannah. Don't be so dramatic." My stepfather added, "She looked incredible in it. You should be proud." Proud. The word echoed through me like a cruel joke. That night, I sat alone in the dark, the ruined dress across my lap. My fingers traced the torn lace, the jagged lines where threads had snapped. I had no tears left, only a strange stillness that settled deep in my bones. "You've taken enough," I whispered into the silence, my voice steadier than I expected. My reflection in the window looked back at me, eyes dark and unyielding. Then I lowered my hand onto the fabric, clutching it tight. "But this time," I said, each word deliberate, "you went too far." The day of Sophia's wedding dawned bright and merciless, sunlight spilling through windows that only made the shadows inside me feel deeper. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing remarkable, and tried to convince myself that showing up was an act of strength rather than surrender. My ruined gown still hung in my closet, silent testimony to what she had taken. Now all I had was dignity, and even that felt fragile. The ceremony was held in a lavish ballroom draped with white roses and crystal chandeliers. Every guest seemed hand-picked from a magazine spread, wealthy, polished, smiling as though nothing ugly had ever touched their lives. I felt the weight of their stares when I walked in, like I was an unwelcome reminder of imperfection in their carefully curated world. Sophia shone at the altar, her designer gown glittering with thousands of sequins, each one catching the light as if the universe bent itself to her glow. Richard, her groom, looked proud and smug, already rehearsing the image of a man who had secured not only a wife, but a performance piece. The vows were exchanged, applause filled the room, and soon the reception began. That was when the cruelty sharpened. I had been placed at a table near the restrooms, half hidden behind a floral arrangement so tall it obscured most of the view. Guests squeezed past me on their way to the bathroom, some offering polite nods, others ignoring me altogether. I tried to eat the salad placed in front of me, but every bite turned to ash in my mouth. Then, during the toasts, Sophia's voice cut through the room. She had taken the microphone, her smile wide, her tone sweetly venomous. "I just want to thank everyone for being here today," she began, pausing for effect. "And of course, my family, especially my sister Hannah." A ripple of polite applause followed, though her eyes glittered with malice. Hannah has always been the responsible one, the serious one, the one who, well, gave up a lot so I could be here today. Isn't that right, sis?" Laughter scattered across the tables. My face burned, but I forced a small smile, my hands clenched in my lap. Sophia leaned closer to the microphone. She never did find someone to walk her down the aisle, but don't worry, she makes a great bridesmaid in life, always standing in the background, holding things together. This time the laughter was louder, crueler. I felt every eye turn toward me, every smirk carving into my skin. I thought I would drown in that moment, until a man I hadn't seen in years rose from his seat at the back of the room. "No," he said clearly, his voice cutting through the laughter. The room stilled. I blinked, heart racing. He stepped forward, tall, composed, eyes steady on Sophia. Recognition struck me like lightning. Noah Carter. Once, long ago, Noah had been a friend, an almost forgotten piece of my past. Back then, he was a young man scraping by, struggling to survive after his parents' bankruptcy. I had offered him what little I could, meals at my table, a spare blanket when he had nowhere to sleep. Then he had disappeared, swallowed by ambition and distance. I had not expected to see him again. Now he wore a tailored suit that fit like it had been crafted for him alone. His presence radiated authority, commanding the room without effort. He turned to the crowd. "Hannah is not some shadow," he said evenly. "She is the reason many of us are standing where we are today. She deserves respect, not ridicule." Whispers broke out, confusion spreading like wildfire. Sophia laughed lightly, but her voice cracked. "And you are?" "Noah Carter," he replied, his smile polite but edged with steel. "CEO of Arcadian Tech. Perhaps you've heard of us." A murmur swept through the room. Arcadian Tech, one of the fastest-growing companies in the country. I watched as recognition dawned on faces, as a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Noah let the silence stretch before adding, "We're currently in partnership discussions with the Harrington family." His gaze slid to Richard's parents, seated at the head table. Their smiles faltered, the color draining from their cheeks. The air changed instantly. Those who had been laughing a moment ago now looked uneasy, their eyes darting between Noah and me. I felt the shift like gravity itself had turned, tilting the room in my direction for the first time in years. Sophia's hands clenched around the microphone, her knuckles white. She forced a brittle laugh. Well, isn't that wonderful? What a surprise. Yes, Noah said, his eyes flicking briefly toward me before returning to her. It is. The rest of the evening unfolded differently. Guests who had ignored me before now stopped by my table, offering compliments and forced smiles. Richard's parents made awkward conversation, asking about my work as if it suddenly mattered. The same relatives who once overlooked me began treating me like someone worth impressing. Through it all, Sophia's smile strained, her laughter pitched too high, her anger visible in every tight gesture. She looked at me with a fury I had never seen before, as though my existence had turned from background noise into a direct threat. As the music swelled and couples danced, Noah approached my table. He leaned down just enough for only me to hear. "Ready to watch them unravel?" he murmured, his voice calm but charged. My breath caught. For the first time in years, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or awake. What if the man everyone dismissed was the one person they should have feared most? After the wedding reception, I found myself seated on the edge of a fountain outside the ballroom, the night air cool against my flushed skin. The laughter and music still echoed faintly from inside, but I needed distance from the glittering cruelty of that room. My hands trembled, not from shame this time, but from the shock of Noah's sudden return. He joined me quietly, his presence steady. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the water's soft trickle between us. Finally, I whispered, "Why now? Why after all these years?" His gaze shifted to the fountain, but his voice carried the weight of memory. "Do you remember the winter after my parents lost everything? I was sleeping in my car, eating scraps when I could. You found me outside the library one night. You brought me into your home, gave me your couch, split your last meal with me." He paused, looking at me with an intensity that made my throat tighten. I swore to myself that night. One day I'd return the favor. A rush of images came back to me, the way Noah had looked then, gaunt and defeated, his eyes hollow. I remembered the blanket I had draped over him, the steaming bowl of soup I had pushed into his hands, telling him he wasn't alone. I hadn't thought of it in years, assuming it was just a fleeting kindness in a life defined by sacrifice. But to him, it had been everything. "You don't owe me anything," I said softly, shaking my head. He smiled faintly. "That's where you're wrong. People forget debts of money, but debts of survival? They stay written in the blood. Tonight wasn't coincidence, Hannah. It was the beginning of something I promised long ago." The weight of his words settled into me, both terrifying and strangely comforting. For so long, I had faced cruelty alone, always outnumbered, always dismissed. Now here was a man who had turned my forgotten kindness into a weapon of steel. It felt like justice, but also like stepping into a storm I couldn't control. I pressed my hands together to still their shaking. "What are you planning?" His smile widened, a glint of something dangerous in his eyes. But this is only the beginning. The following days carried ripples that spread quickly. Rumors began to swirl among Richard's family, whispers about Sophia's accomplishments not quite adding up, questions about where her money had come from, who had truly supported her art, and how she had afforded the luxuries she flaunted. I knew the answers, of course. They were written in the calluses on my hands, in the years I had sacrificed, in the bills I had paid without recognition. But now, others were beginning to notice. One evening, as I left the school where I taught, I overheard two parents in the parking lot. "They say her sister was the real one keeping things afloat, that Sophia's career was more smoke than fire." The words made me pause, heat rising in my chest. For the first time, someone else was saying what I had lived all along. At home, the cracks deepened. Richard's parents scrutinized Sophia with new suspicion. Their questions grew sharper. Where had her connections really come from? What kind of family had she hidden behind glittering smiles? And why did this quiet sister, this schoolteacher, command the respect of a man like Noah Carter? Sophia's confidence faltered. I saw it in the way her texts to me shifted from gloating to desperate. "We need to talk. Please, Hannah, I didn't mean to hurt you, but I said nothing. For once, silence was my shield. I let her words pile up, unanswered, until they became a weight she carried alone. Nights were quieter then. I would sit by my window, watching the city lights, my ruined wedding dress folded carefully in its bag at the foot of my bed. Part of me longed to forgive, to let go, to believe that family could be mended. Another part, colder and sharper, wanted the wound to stay open until justice was complete. I felt torn between the two selves, the woman who still loved her sister and the one who wanted her to feel every ounce of humiliation she had heaped on me. The tension only grew heavier when I learned of the message. It was Sophia who showed it to me, her face pale, hands shaking as she thrust her phone toward me. An anonymous number had sent her a single line. "The dress wasn't the only thing you stole." Her voice trembled. "Do you know who sent this?" I met her gaze, unreadable. "No, Sophia, I don't." But inside, my heart thundered because I knew this was the unraveling Noah had promised, and it was only just beginning. The anonymous message had unsettled Sophia, but it was only the first tremor before the earthquake. Within weeks, the ground beneath her life began to crack. The Harringtons, her new in-laws, grew visibly tense at dinners, their smiles brittle. Richard's father avoided eye contact, while his mother's once sweet voice hardened into clipped interrogations. Sophia tried to maintain her charm, but her laughter sounded forced, like glass about to shatter. Then came the blow Noah had promised. Arcadian Tech abruptly withdrew from its pending partnership with the Harringtons, pulling millions of dollars of projected revenue with it. The announcement hit the financial press like a thunderclap. Overnight, headlines screamed of Harrington collapse. Their stock dipped, and whispers of bad management swirled across boardrooms. Sophia tried to spin it, insisting to Richard that it was just a minor setback, but he had already begun to unravel. His phone buzzed constantly with angry shareholders, his family blaming him for trusting too easily. When the press began digging deeper, the story turned personal. A blog post appeared first. The truth behind Sophia Miller's rise. It painted her as a fraud who had leaned on her sister's sacrifices to fund her so-called success. Screenshots followed. Old social media posts, financial inconsistencies, accounts of classmates who remembered me paying Sophia's way through school while she basked in attention. It spread like wildfire. Soon, larger outlets picked it up, amplifying the humiliation. Photographs of Sophia in my ruined wedding dress circulated with captions mocking her selfishness. Talk show hosts cracked jokes at her expense. Where she had once been adored, she was now ridiculed. I watched it unfold from my small apartment, the glow of the television casting shadows on my walls. It should have satisfied me, and part of it did. Justice was being served without my lifting a hand. But another part of me, softer, wondered if this was what retribution was meant to feel like, cold, hollow, endless. Meanwhile, Sophia's marriage began to fracture under the weight of the scandal. Richard stopped coming home some nights. When he did, he carried the smell of alcohol and contempt. Their arguments spilled into public view, paparazzi catching them shouting outside restaurants, Sophia's mascara streaked down her face. Her friends, once eager to bask in her glow, ghosted her calls. Invitations dried up. The spotlight she had craved turned harsh, exposing every flaw. I might have pitied her, if not for the memory of her twirling in my gown, wine splashing down the lace as she laughed. That image hardened me whenever my sympathy threatened to surface. The breaking point came one evening in their family's mansion. Voices carried down the hall, raw with rage. I had gone reluctantly at my mother's urging, only to stand frozen outside the door as Sophia screamed, her voice sharp enough to pierce walls. "You chose me over her!" she shouted at our parents, words laced with desperation. "You pushed her aside, you told her she didn't matter, and now we all pay the price." The silence that followed was heavier than the shout itself. For once, even my mother and stepfather had no defense. Later, they sought me out, their faces drawn and desperate. My stepfather spoke first, his tone almost pleading. "Hannah, We were wrong. We see that now. Please, help your sister. She's lost everything." My mother reached for my hand, her eyes shimmering with tears. "She needs you. We need you. Family should stand together." But the word family no longer rang with warmth. It was brittle, fractured, a lie I had clung to for too long. At gatherings, relatives whispered among themselves. Some pulled me aside, offering hushed apologies for years of neglect, choosing to stand with me now that the truth was undeniable. Others stayed loyal to Sophia, convinced she was simply misunderstood. The division tore through the family like a fault line, breaking bonds that might never mend. Sophia herself was a shell of the woman she had been. I found her one night on my doorstep, hair disheveled, mascara smeared, her sobs raw and childlike. She fell to her knees, clutching at my skirt. "Hannah, please!" she cried. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was stupid. I was cruel, but you're my sister. Don't let me lose everything. Forgive me." Her words cut through me, but so did the memory of every slight, every humiliation. My throat tightened. I wanted to lift her up, to embrace her, to tell her it was over, but my hands stayed frozen at my sides. That night, alone in my apartment, I broke down. Tears came in waves, unstoppable. I pressed my palms to my face, gasping against the sobs. For years, I had dreamed of this reckoning, but living it was something else entirely. Justice felt like ashes in my mouth. Through the tears, I whispered to the darkness, "I wanted justice. But why does it hurt so much?" The weeks that followed Sophia's collapse felt strangely quiet. The constant storm of drama, accusations, and scandal had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind only debris. I walked through my days lighter somehow, no longer bound by the invisible chains of sacrifice and silence that had defined me for so long. Yet freedom didn't feel like triumph. It felt like healing, slow, tender, and fragile. For the first time in years, I began to say no. No to late-night calls from my mother demanding I fix what Sophia had broken. No to colleagues who assumed I would always take on extra work without complaint. No to the quiet voice in my head that whispered I wasn't enough unless I was giving everything away. Each no was terrifying, but also exhilarating, a reclaiming of the space I had long abandoned. I learned to give myself yeses in their place. Yes to long walks after school, just me in the open sky. Yes to trying pottery, my hands messy with clay as I shaped something imperfect but mine. Yes to sleeping in on weekends, sunlight warming my face without guilt. Small things, ordinary things, but they became the stitches closing wounds that had bled for years. Noah was there often, steady as ever. He didn't push, didn't demand, simply stood by me as someone who remembered the girl who had once offered him soup and a blanket when she had little to spare. One evening, as we sat on a park bench watching children chase bubbles across the grass, he turned to me. "Hannah," he said quietly, "we've both carried debts and promises long enough. Maybe it's time we carry something else, together." My breath caught, his words tender but filled with the weight of possibility. For a moment I imagined it, a life built not on sacrifice but on mutual choice, a partnership where I was not an afterthought but a center. It was tempting, achingly so, but I shook my head gently. "I'm not ready, not yet. I've lived too long for others. I need to live for myself before I can live with someone else." He studied me for a moment, then smiled, not disappointed, but proud. "Then I'll wait," he said simply. That night, I lay in bed with a strange sense of peace. I hadn't chosen victory, hadn't chosen revenge, but I had chosen myself, and that, I realized, was more powerful than either. Meanwhile, Sophia's world continued to collapse. Her marriage crumbled publicly. Divorce papers splashed across tabloids with brutal headlines. Richard moved on quickly, his arm draped around another woman in glossy photos, while Sophia was left to weather the storm alone. Friends abandoned her, her reputation reduced to a cautionary tale whispered over champagne flutes. I heard she had moved back into our parents' house, no longer the glittering star, but a fallen figure haunted by whispers of disgrace. She rarely left the house, and when she did, heads turned for all the wrong reasons. Once she had stolen my wedding dress to bask in borrowed light. Now, she couldn't even step into daylight without being burned by her own shame. I didn't hate her anymore. That surprised me most of all. The anger had drained away, leaving behind something quieter, like the ache of an old scar. Forgiveness never came, but neither did the desire to strike again. She had her punishment, one far harsher than anything I could have engineered. One afternoon, as I stood at the threshold of my classroom, watching my students pack their bags and chatter about weekend plans, I felt something shift inside me. This was my life now, imperfect, ordinary, but mine. And for the first time, it was enough. Later, I received a message from Noah. "Dinner this weekend? No pressure, just two friends, breathing easier." I smiled, tucking the phone into my pocket. Yes, I thought, that I could say yes to. The final threads of my old life unraveled quietly. My parents still called sometimes, voices weary, hoping to bridge gaps they had dug too deep. I answered politely, but never allowed myself to be pulled back into their orbit. Boundaries became my shield, not walls, but lines drawn in firm, steady ink. Blood had failed me, but family had found me anyway. In friends, in students who looked up at me with bright eyes, in the man who had remembered a kindness long after the world forgot it. I no longer needed Sophia's apology, or my parents' approval, or society's validation. I had my own. As I walked home that evening, the city lights flickering to life around me, I whispered to myself the truth I had carried quietly for years, but only now believed. Blood doesn't always mean family. Sometimes family is the one who chooses to stand by you. And with that, I stepped forward, lighter than I had ever been, into a life that was finally, fully mine.